All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, November 2nd, 1977, President Carter signs legislation increasing the paychecks of many of the country's lowest paid workers. This would come to boost their pay by 45%. We are talking, of course, about a new minimum wage. Carter's bold legislation would, over the course of 4 years, phase in a boost to the minimum wage all the way up to $3.35. Of course, that sounds small now. The federal minimum wage now is $7.25. A lot of states have set it higher. And there is a high-profile fight, of course, to raise it up to $10 or $15. But the history of minimum wage is not that long, and it is one in which basically every year or two it has been increased until, that is, you get into the 80s and 90s, and then a little over 10 years ago, it just stops, and we have not raised the minimum wage ever since. So that is something that we will get into. And this moment in 1977 where Carter increases the minimum wage is a nice way to get at some of the larger history of it. So here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Finally, a positive Carter episode. I've been waiting for this. Hello, Jody.
Yes.
Hi. Hey there.
That's true.
I'm here for this.
Yeah, signing legislation, putting his name on something.
Improving people's lives.
Yes. Yeah. Certainly there were detractors, and we will get to that. But, you know, let's talk about this moment with this ceremony with Carter. I mean, one thing that's interesting is that at this signing ceremony are people who were part of the very first minimum wage legislation in this country in the 30s. And I mean, that just strikes me because it's just a reminder that, like, this is not that long of a history.
Yeah, it's crazy that everything in 1933, Roosevelt's National Industrial Recovery Act institutes like the first what we would call minimum wage, but it gets declared unconstitutional. And then later in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act establishes about a quarter an hour, or what would be like $4.60 in 2020 dollars. But it still exempted a lot of people from that wage, so not everybody has access to that floor. But this has been a long, hard fight, or maybe, depending on how you look at it, a very short-lived fight in terms of how people have thought about what should be the economic floor or foundation for wages in this country.
Yeah, and those carve-outs were really important. I mean, one of the reasons that the Fair Labor Standards Act is able to be passed in 1938, you have to get Southern white Democrats on board. And they don't want, for instance, agricultural workers or domestic workers to be subject to this federal minimum wage because it would mean they would have to pay Black workers more. And so there are all of these carve-outs, and it takes decades to begin to bring more and more of those people into this federal wage protection.
Yeah, and that is sort of continued, that opposition often from southern states has continued throughout the history of minimum wage. I think there's been times when it's been argued that, this is a tool of the North to economically suppress the South, and that, the South especially at the turn of the 19th century and into the 20th century, the South needed to rebuild its economy, and a minimum wage would stagnate that progress. And this 77 amendment eliminates some of these carve-outs, right, and takes away the lower minimum wage for agricultural employers. So it is an attempt to basically try and even the playing field across the board, across the country.
Right. And it was especially important in the late 1970s to begin thinking about raising the minimum wage because, the big story economically of the 1970s is the story of inflation and of the gas shock. And so prices for essentials had gone up, but the federal minimum wage hadn't quite caught up. And the reason we know that is because it's actually in 1968, when the federal minimum wage was $1.60, that it had its most purchasing power. I mean, that would have been worth over $11 in today's money. And the federal minimum wage has never gotten that high. And so there's this sense by the time Carter's president that you got to start catching back up to where we were in the 1960s.
And to give some context, I think it's important, if you think in 1977, a gallon of gas is about 62 cents. So to fill up your gas is still going to take a significant portion of your check, especially if you think 3 years later in 1980, gas is like $1.20, $1.19. So being able to have not just a minimum wage, but a living wage is still something that's so difficult for many people to ascertain because most of their check is just going to basic survival. And even that is not enough.
Yeah, and that is a sort of two interesting things that you have to keep in mind as you look at the history of minimum wage, which is, on the one hand, yes, there has been, up until recently, consistent raising of it almost every year. I mean, I'm looking at the list here, and it's like, basically in 38, 39, 45, 50, 56, 61, 63, 64, like they raised, it's like a standard thing that they raise the minimum wage, but very rarely, maybe only, for a very small period in the late 60s, did it actually feel like it was keeping up with inflation. And so now I would argue we're kind of at the worst of both worlds, which is where we haven't even done the pro forma raising of the minimum wage for the last 10, 15 years. And we certainly haven't done it to a point that seems to match with cost of living and inflation.
I mean, imagine if minimum wage had a cost of living adjustment the same way that something like Medicare does. It would look a lot different than it does now.
Yeah, I don't have in front of me what that number would be, but I think it might even be higher than the 15 that a lot of people are fighting for.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. And so this, I guess, starts to get into some of the ways that minimum wage, like a lot of stuff in this country, we have a federal minimum wage, but really you have to kind of look state by state. And a lot of states have set their own minimum wage, and some states do have a cost of living adjustment built in, but almost 30 states, I think, have their own minimum wage. A few states do not have a minimum wage and just say, okay, we're going to follow what the federal rate is. I do want to shout out Georgia, which still on its books has a $5.15 minimum wage, the only state minimum wage that is lower than the federal minimum wage. At the end of the day, there are very, very, very few employees in Georgia who get that amount of money because most of them are subject to the Fair Labor Standards Act, which still governs it. But nevertheless, I don't know.
If you can pay people less.
Yeah, it's just like Georgia going out of its way, it seems to me, to put that on the books. It is crazy. And the highest minimum wage, New York has around $12, and that is creeping up. Washington State has around $13, $14. And
I was going to say Massachusetts is about $13.25.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's slated to go up to $15 in the next couple of years. They also sort of have like a stair step increase of like 50 cents every year until they get up to $15 an hour. Yeah. These are also some of the most expensive states to live in too. So, given that $15 an hour may seem really high or maybe even doable in the South, but in places like New York, Massachusetts, California, Seattle, that's still not sufficient.
Yeah, when Barack Obama was running in 2009, he was promoting around a $9 minimum wage. And by the time he runs for re-election in 2012, he's moved to, I think, $11. But what's important about that is there is a campaign to raise the minimum wage that is pushing him along. It's in 2012 that you get the emergence of Fight for 15. And that begins to take hold, as you guys are talking about, in these local areas, right? It takes place in Seattle. It takes place in cities, and then it begins to be adopted by states. So this is one of those things, I think, where states are really going to be driving whatever eventually happens to the federal minimum wage.
So, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the political dimensions here. I mean, I feel like you have grassroots activism, which is pushing here. I think that the opposition to minimum wage, as we've been discussing, I think has often it's this funny thing where both sides of this in some ways are making the same arguments, which is basically like, yes, we're concerned for the lowest wage, the most vulnerable workers, often minorities and women. And, the Fight for 15 folks say we got to raise that bottom rung of the ladder as high as possible to lift people up. And opponents say, no, if you're concerned about African Americans and Latinos and women, what you need to do is expand the market as much as possible and create as many jobs as possible. And if you raise the minimum wage, there'll be fewer jobs available and people won't even get on the ladder to work their way up it. It just strikes me as interesting that both sides are at least couching their argument in similar terms.
Right, because it's the most politically palatable. This idea that you're looking out for the poor and vulnerable, but especially in a tight labor market, that seems a falsifiable argument, right? That there is a need for laborers, which I think is why you're seeing such a push for higher wages right at this moment, because there's a sense that
people no longer want to go back to jobs that don't pay them enough to live their lives. And so a big part of it's interesting, my niece was looking for a job. She got offered like 3 jobs right away and turned them all down because they were all like $8 an hour. And she's like, I can't live off $8 an hour.
How old is she?
She's 23. She just
right.
graduated
So
college.
she's like actually in the labor market. Yeah. Right.
Yes. And so none of these are good alternatives.
Totally. Yeah. Well, I mean, and there's this really interesting moment now where I think a lot of potential employees or existing employees who have left their jobs are sort of just asking these fundamental questions and taking a harder line and saying, no, like, I'm in the driver's seat here in these negotiations and you want me, let's do it at this rate.
And these are not all high schoolers looking for a summer job. You know what I mean? Like, this is something temporary to get them some cash in their pockets. That's not what
that demographic enters into the conversation a lot too, which is people saying, well, look, most people who are getting minimum wage are summer jobs or high schoolers or so forth, and do we really want to be paying them $15 an hour? And part of me is like, yeah, sure, why not? But also, but also I think that there's this larger context of that there are a lot of people who are trying to, live their lives and who are actually trying to put together a livelihood on minimum wage, and that just no longer cuts it because of the cost of living in this country. Yeah,
just to give people a sense, the current minimum wage, if you were working full time for 50 weeks a year, gets you about $14,500. So probably not enough to live off of.
Yeah.
No, that's poverty level.
Yeah.
That really is. I mean, it also begs the question: what role should or do major corporations play? Because when I think about, in my history class, we talk about Henry Ford and how he revolutionized the labor force with a $5 a day wage, and people are like, oh my gosh, $5 a day. This is 1913, 1914. That's huge. Or we think about how like Starbucks or Amazon has like put out, hey, we're paying $15 an hour. There's part of this, I think, that also gets pushed by big corporations that can afford those wages, but then also still have labor conditions that don't necessarily meet the worthiness of those wages either. Mm-hmm. So it's a major conflict.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I think about as context here is, when we're looking at 1977, for instance, and we have this debate over minimum wage, that debate is happening, let's call it a debate over where we're going to put the bottom rung of the ladder. That debate is happening in an America in which everyone sort of takes as a given that the ladder exists, right? And that if you get on the bottom rung, then there'll be another rung and there'll be another rung. And I know that's very complicated for a lot of people. There haven't been, but I think for a good part of this country's history, there has been that ladder. And I think a big story of the last 15, 20 years is that, for a lot of reasons, is that ladder doesn't exist in the way it used to. And so then the question is, well, if the ladder isn't there, if that next rung isn't there, maybe that bottom rung needs to be a little higher.
That's true. There's a lot, I think, that goes into not just creating, wages, but also, health benefits and, will your job help pay for your schooling or education, or, will they help you purchase a home, like debt relief? I think there's a lot more to it than just establishing a wage. It's also sort of the quality of life on that job.
Final question. I mean, Niki, you're the Obama era watcher here. I mean, I'm just curious, it is striking that this history of raising the minimum wage stalls out under Barack Obama and early in Barack Obama's administration. And, what is your sense of why, especially for someone, as you said, who pledged to raise it? It was part of their political platform, not just their economic values. What is your sense of why it just didn't get done?
I mean, a lot of it got sidelined for these bigger projects that the administration was working on, some of which got passed, like the Affordable Care Act, which has made a huge difference in a lot of people's lives, and some of which failed, like cap and trade climate legislation. And they put all of their energies into that. And they were going to get around to things like the minimum wage, like immigration. And by the time they get around to it, they no longer have a 60-vote majority in the Senate, and they're unable to pass almost any of their legislative agenda. There's just not the support for Republicans for raising the minimum wage. And that's when this campaign really does move to the local and state level.
And of course, now there's been attempts to sort of fold it into the much larger infrastructure and human infrastructure
everything's
bills,
in that bill.
And then it's, but that one seems to, at least at this moment, have been taken out, and there's kicking the can down the road yet again. Okay. As we wrap up, I do want to say a couple also on this days, only because we are now it is November 2nd, right? We are now in the heart of election dates. And so, I'm just, when you're in November 2nd, 3rd, 4th, those are election days. And so 1948 on this day, Harry Truman defeats Thomas Dewey. 1976 is when our man Jimmy Carter defeats Gerald Ford. And 2004 is when Bush wins re-election over John Kerry. It is that season. All right. That's the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is the only software your business will ever need. Featuring a suite of integrated business applications, Odoo connects your business operations together so you can get more done in less time. Odoo has apps for everything: CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, marketing, manufacturing, you name it, Odoo's got it. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia from PRX.